This is Just a Few Questions. I'm Marc Sims. My guest is Andrew Papachristos, Ph.D. Andrew Papachristos is a professor of sociology at Northwestern University. Welcome to the show, Andrew Papachristos.
Oh, thanks, Mark. Glad to be back.
I'm so happy that you're here. So let's get right into it. Wait, you got a new job. So you was the director of the Institute for Policy Research. Did I get it right?
That's right. You did. As of September 1, one of my jobs, I got a couple of them, is the director of the Institute for Policy Research here at Northwestern, which actually started back in the late 60s, as the Center for Urban Policy Analysis. Since then, has really been trying to bring some of Northwestern's, best researchers to focus on policy and social issues.
Well, that's why I brought you here. You're the person to ask to answer this question. I was watching one of your video presentations a while back, and you used this term, and I want you to explain it. So, what are neighborhood fixed effects?
All right, neighborhood fixed effects. Good question, Mark. You're always asking me good questions. So, let's start with a quote, right? Which is one that says, "Look, all statistical models are wrong, but some are useful," right? And it's this idea that when social scientists are using different types of data to model things, right, you're never going to be able to capture everything in the real world. So when we're talking about cities, and cities like Chicago, but it's really every city in the world. Everybody's like, my neighborhood is unique. My neighborhood's got something going on. There's a historical artifact. There's a policy that exists, formal or informal. No statistical model can capture all of that, right? And if they might be able to capture it for one neighborhood, what about capturing that same kind of information for other neighborhoods? So what fixed effects do, and it's a statistical property, it's a way to approach when you're modeling things like neighborhoods or schools or classrooms, is it creates a variable that's unique to that neighborhood. Now, you might not be able to measure whatever it is that's unique, right? Maybe it's a history of highly structured street gangs, or a history of police brutality, or have lead pipes, or the high school is particularly large or small. But what it does is it allows the statistical model to say, yeah, there is something unique about neighborhood A and neighborhood B and neighborhood C, and they're different. And it lets you assess that relative to things you can measure, right? So in lots of statistical models, we have data on things like race, percent household renting, crime, and so on and so on, but we don't have the same level of detail on things that are unique or hard to measure. So what neighborhood fixed effects allow you to do is say, like, look, once we consider all the things that exist that we can measure, and then we create this variable for the unique neighborhood, if that is something that becomes, say, significant in the statistical model, it says, yeah, there's something about this neighborhood that's special or unique. And we might not know what it is, but we know that there's something about this neighborhood above and beyond things you can measure, like poverty or education or income. So it lets us account for things that you don't measure, that people know are important, and say, yeah, something's going on here. So again, it's not as precise as everybody wants it to be, but it lets us acknowledge that there are these huge limitations and things that are important beyond stuff that show up in the census or a survey or whatever the case might be.
And I have a lot of half-baked ideals. and
most
of them, a lot of them are half-baked because there are things that really can't be measured. And that's why I was interested in this neighborhood fixed effects. Now, I'm just familiar with the South Side of Chicago, mainly, born and raised here all my life. And a lot of the crime here in Chicago and cities like Chicago are, perpetrated by African Americans. We know the story, legacy of slavery, segregation, discrimination, blah, 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 blah. But the one I like to talk about on some of my podcasts, which is not really nice to talk about in polite company, is that legacy of slavery, and how we African Americans don't really trust each other the way we should because of this legacy of slavery. And we don't have the social cohesion or the collective efficacy that we should to end some of these problems in these lower income neighborhoods in places like Chicago. So, the question is, can social cohesion or collective efficacy or lack of distrust in that neighborhood or on that block, can that be measured and solved?
So first of all, I'm not sure if you called me polite or impolite company there, Mark, but let's just go with it all the same. Just kidding, of course. let me give you an example that you have. So first of all, yeah, how do you measure the legacy of slavery when we don't have data that goes back 400 years, right? Does an equation, a statistical model, can any statistical model do that? The answer is no. But there's also other ways of knowing: history, experience. There are other ways of knowing besides, say, just statistical models, which are important. But when you look at a city like Chicago, and I know you mentioned the South Side, but how do we compare the South Side and the West Side, for example? The Black South Side and the Black West Side, and they're different, right? They have different histories, different institutions. One is much older, especially the population of the South Side, and how the Black metropolis developed and Bronzeville developed, and how that history is very, very important. They have older institutions, right? Older political, Black political power and Black political struggles on the South Side as compared to the West Side. It doesn't mean both don't have high levels of crime or other sorts of things that we kind of might look at in the policy perspective, but it is understanding that what exists on the South Side is different. And it's a modest way, fixed effects are a modest way to capture that. Can we capture collective efficacy or informal social control? We absolutely know how to measure it. We know how to measure it quite well. And we also know it's different, by the way, not just between across state different Black neighborhoods, but also between Black and Latino neighborhoods and Latino and white neighborhoods, and Black and white neighborhoods, say like Albany Park or Rogers Park that might have splits within them. There are ways to measure it. It costs money, and you have to do it pretty often to measure it, right, from the survey perspective. So, I think what people have traditionally done, or scientists have traditionally done, is kind of captured those things with snapshots and surveys, and then use other types of work and other types of research, historical, ethnographic, qualitative, interviews, to really unpack what collective efficacy looks like. And there's been a bunch of great studies in Chicago that have done that at Little Village, on the South Side, on the West Side, and even sort of in white neighborhoods in Chicago as well, to understand how do you activate these things that we know are important: networks among neighbors, networks among neighborhood institutions. And again, some of that is stuff you need to understand by being part of a community or being on the ground and having those conversations, as opposed to, just kind of using a survey instrument or a statistical model. So.
And you've probably seen this. Let me say this again. You are a polite company. Let's be clear here. very,
I just want to make sure.
Very polite, very polite company, right? Yeah. And so you know these things probably way better than I do. Of course, not probably, you do. Even in a low income neighborhood, there are people with different values. So you could be a low income household, low income parent, single parent, blah blah blah, but you have this value that my child, even if they go to that neighborhood school down the street, that underfunded low-income neighborhood school, they're going to get the best education. I'm going to make sure they get the best education possible, because that's the value that I have as a parent, and that's the value we have in our home. Can that be measured? And when I say be measured, that so the parents who don't have that value, and of course in certain neighborhoods, some parents with higher incomes, whatever, they have left those neighborhoods. So some children don't see those other values. Those other values are weird, or it's okay to not get straight A's or straight B's, but if you come to school every day, you get a C, you're going to be okay in life. You probably won't stumble into a life of crime. Do you see that kind of stuff? Or is there some research out there that measures those different values and outcomes?
So, Mark, once again, don't undersell yourself. You're an expert here too, and you're asking great questions. So I'll try to do this as briefly as I can. You're using the word value, and I understand how you're using it, and I understand that this is how a lot of us talk about it. So the short answer is, can we measure these things that people sometimes call values or beliefs or norms? The short answer is yes. Historically, there was this period of time when a lot of that led towards, I'm not saying you said this, but from a policy perspective, ended up blaming communities that were historically disadvantaged for having the wrong values, where you believe that violence is okay, or you believe that it's okay to do A, B, C, and D. And we know that that's simply not true, not just from reality, but from every shred of scientific evidence. And the evidence we have shows that individuals in kind of historically disadvantaged and disenfranchised communities actually have a bundle of different values, right? They're actually exposed to more different types of frames, ways of viewing the world. So even in the example that you gave, a family that's really stressing education, right? Or a family that's really stressing religion, right? Not all do stress those sorts of things, but most and many do. They get bundled together. And then on top of that, they have this issue of how they're going to navigate safety in ways, say, somebody in a neighborhood that has lower levels of violence doesn't. So what you have is you have multiple more lenses or tools in the way you navigate your neighborhood. And sometimes you have to prioritize one or another. And we can measure and capture these things. And we have to be careful how we talk about them from a policy perspective, because a lot of times it does often end up, blaming people who are either victims or people who have lived in conditions that are beyond their control. And again, in Chicago and in this country, this goes back hundreds of years. It's not something just happened. The neighborhoods we talk about have had, say, high levels of violence for 60 years, 70 years. And so you're born in that neighborhood. You have to know a bunch of these different ways of looking at your space, your school, your transportation system, simply to be safe and to navigate those places. And then they're bundled together with the things you learn at home and from your friends and in the classroom and outside the classroom and on social media. And how you figure out which one to, say, work on with a particular policy, that's what public debate is for. That's why we elect certain individuals. So hopefully they'll focus on the things in that bundle that we want them to focus on.
And that's why when I hear all the prescriptions, I know professors like yourself, you do the analysis and statistical data and all that kind of stuff, and not so much into the policy prescriptions or how to solve these issues, which I totally understand. But when I hear crime, I hear this, I hear that, no one talks about, like, this is what I say off camera. This is why I don't have a lot of friends, especially African-American friends, although I'm African-American. Is that because I talk like this. And I talk to people off the air. I say, if you're not talking about how that black boy is doing in that low-performing, underfunded public school in this neighborhood, you're not talking about how that kid is going to matriculate and do well in life, I don't want to hear anything you're saying. I don't want to hear anything, because it really comes down to how. I'm not saying everybody get straight A's like I said earlier, but you go to school every day. You do the best you can, and hopefully have a school that demystifies this thing called learning, to teach that low-income child in that low-income neighborhood how to learn. Don't compare yourself with the best students or the better schools or the better. You're going to be just fine. I'm going to show you how to do this. If you're not talking about that, and I don't really hear much about that, because a lot of people who are professionals, they went to good schools. They did well in school. Maybe they were had an imposter syndrome in high school and college, but they didn't really suffer. So I don't know if they can really feel the pain of being a student that really suffers in that grammar school and say, my life is over. This school ain't for me. I'm just going to just go out there. If I'm babbling, but it doesn't make sense. The babble makes sense, Professor. Try and get the professor back.
Sorry about that.
No, that was probably my T-Mobile. So I was babbling. So when did I lose you on the babble?
I heard you. You were talking about, is anybody looking at these issues around schooling and young black men and how they learn and all that sort of thing. And are we rolling?
No, we rolling, man. I may even edit none of this. This is good. Keep going, Professor.
Well, What I was going to say is, I'm not going to answer it too much, but there are a lot of people that look exactly at what you're talking about, learning differences, across racial and ethnic groups, learning differences across ages and gender, and learning gaps and opportunities. And so we actually do know a lot about it. Again, we know a lot about a lot of things. We know a lot about crime. We know a lot about violence. We actually know a lot about gun violence, right? The question is, how do we do something about it? And that's actually not a research question. That's a policy question. That is a question of, going back to the gun violence space, there's actually pretty uniform agreement across gun owners that's consistent with research about things we do that can make us safer. None of that translates into policy. And it doesn't translate into policy not because our research is imperfect, though of course all research is imperfect, but it actually doesn't translate into policy because of political will and sort of how we elect folks and who we elect, right? And the same thing is true of education policies. We know a lot about how kids learn. We actually know a lot about learning loss. We know a lot about what happens during pandemics or being exposed to violence and its effect on learning. And yet how we translate those things into policy is a separate sort of pathway. And, that's kind of, part of what we try to do at IPR, of course, is to try to get some of these things in front of policymakers, but we're not policymakers, right? We are professionals in the space. We're also voters. We're also parents. But at the same time, how that gets translated into action, that's what all of us need to figure out together. Is how do we get these things that we know that are best practices? And by the way, not just do the things we know will help, but stop doing things we know hurt people. And those two things are often treated very differently, where we forget that we're doing things that might be harming kids or harming individuals, and we keep doing it. Which is just as important to stop doing those things as it is to do things that will help people.
Professor, I can talk about this subject forever, of course, but you got a lot of stuff to do in Evanston, Illinois. First, thank you for being my guest. Like, leave us. I'm sort of like hopeful and depressed at the same time, because we got to rely on politicians to implement policies for the underclass and the forgotten and the abandoned, and we've never been pretty good at that in this country. But so give us a hope that maybe in the future, maybe in the city of Chicago, some other town, that the policymakers will take research from a person like, your institute in Northwestern and Professor Papachristos and implement. Is there some hope, Professor?
I think there's a lot of hope, because here's what we see every day, right? My team, my work, but everybody else, there are people out there doing the work in neighborhoods every day. If they didn't, I think our city would be doomed, but it's not. Despite what shows up in headlines, there are people that, are out there wearing the shoe leather off their shoes, out there helping kids, out there trying to stop violence, out there trying to get people fed, out there trying to help kids learn. It's happening. It's happening every day. We don't put a lot of attention on that because we are always, for good reason, focusing on headlines. Part of what needs to happen, and I think we see this, even in the violence prevention space, where my own research has been these last, 20 years, I've seen so much progress in Chicago these last 5 to 7 years. It keeps me going. There are organizations that are working together that have never worked together, right? They're sharing resources. They're sharing information. They're sharing money, right? And they're working on projects every day, even on the hard days. That, to me, suggests we're still going in the right direction. And I've mentioned this before in things I've written. And again, I can speak mainly about the violence prevention space, but I know this is happening in these other spaces. If our goal is to build infrastructure, things that are larger than just individuals in our neighborhoods, connecting our neighborhoods, it takes a long time to build those things. If we think, going back to your earlier comment, Mark, how many decades it took us to get where we are in terms of inequality, in terms of these structural conditions that keep beating folks down and keeping folks in place, it's going to take us a long time to undo it. And we should work as fast and hard as we can, but we have to acknowledge the work that's happening now every day. Because the folks that are doing it are tired, it's a hard struggle, of course, and they're there. And I hope they continue to get more and more resources. I hope they continue to get the good work elevated, but I see it. And most folks that are out there see it. It's a hard struggle. And so, I think that gives me hope. I think people in the city have been listening. I hope they continue to listen. By the way, the county and the state as well. There are lots of opportunities that are converging, and we need to kind of keep our eyes on that and keep pushing.